Greetings DCS community, Diesel Thunder here, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're in the F-16C, an aircraft in which a guest here on the channel has flown in real life. I'd also like to welcome you to my first special feature, and if you saw the thumbnail for this video, you likely have a very good idea of what the subject of today's video is about. We were able to get up close and personal with the Phantom. Whoops, wrong Phantom. This Phantom is the star of today's video. My son and I recently had the opportunity to be guests of the crew who maintains and flies this Phantom, and is the only civilian-owned flight-worthy Phantom. This hard-wing F-4D is under the ownership of the Collings Foundation, which is an organization dedicated to the preservation and display of automotive and aviation history. The Phantom was going through a maintenance check, which included starting up both engines, checking out all the systems, and some maintenance on the hydraulics. After the checks were complete, a brief taxi test was conducted. My son was very lucky, as he got to sit backseat for the engine run-up and taxi. Now, before we get to the video, I'd like to apologize first, as the video quality settings was missed on the tripod-mounted camera. Rest assured, those responsible here at Diesel Thunder Productions were sacked. Also, while all this was going on, you may hear various warbirds in the background. As this was a nice day, Lone Star Flight Museum had their T-6 Texan and B-25 Mitchell flying near the airfield. I hope you enjoy this featured presentation. crew didn't like how long engine 2 took to start earlier, so they did a restart to check and make sure that there was not an issue that they needed to look into further.
Fire the hole.
Fire the hole. Fire the hole.
There ain't no hole to look at.
Wait, let's make our open this hallway and I can tap it. There's no saying about the F-4 fan. You know how you can tell it's out of fluid? It's not leaking.
You know the impressive thing? Yes, there's a lot of buttons. Most of it. Okay?
So, have something down? Or,
Phantom was pushed back safely into her hangar, I had the opportunity to sit and talk with retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, call sign Bluto. He flew the F-4 Phantoms, as well as F-16 Vipers during his time on active duty. Bluto gives us some insight on flying the Phantom and offers some advice to those looking forward to Heepler's DCS F-4E release later this year. During the interview, we were interrupted, but in a good way. The B-25 Mitchell that had been flying around earlier had taxied past and on its way to go get fuel. All right, well, good day, everybody. I'm here with Pilot Bluto, a retired Air Force Colonel?
Lieutenant Colonel, retired. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your service, sir.
I appreciate that.
And
Thank you.
he is an actual Phantom driver and then later an F-16 Viper driver, but our interest today is in the Phantom that you just got to see flying around. So, Bluto, sir, if you could tell me, what is it like to actually fly this bird?
The Phantom's a pretty feel-oriented airplane, so you're definitely, you're not going to get that with, as we talked about, so probably some good rules of thumb that you want to keep in mind. The Phantom likes to go about 400 knots.
Okay.
You get much slower than that, and the ways you have to fly the airplane, flight controls you start to change a little bit. So if you stay, under 20,000 feet and over 400 knots, it's its happy place.
Nice. Now, what would be a typical either mission loadout or a combat loadout as far as like weapons and fuel tanks and that kind of configuration? Because it's the one thing we get to do in DCS is play with all sorts of configurations that probably would not ever fly.
Excellent. Well, the Phantom flew every mission, so it could be anything. If you're going out back in the day to do a typical air-to-air loadout, might be. Primarily heat-seeking missiles in the beginning, and then we moved on to the semi-active radar missiles.
Could this thing carry the 120?
There are variants of it that could.
Okay. Like the early A model, probably.
No, you're talking the AIM-120?
Yes, sir.
Sure. So I think primarily it would have been the foreign military sale versions that carried it. I don't believe in some of the Wild Weasel guys could correct me on this, but I don't believe the G was ever modified to carry the
Okay.
So we're primarily AIM-7 shooters back in the day.
Okay, the Sparrow and the Sidewinder?
And the Sidewinder.
Okay. Now, as far as air to mud, what weapons would you typically carry in?
Oh, everything,
All the Mark 80 series?
Sure.
Okay. Any laser guided at some point?
Sure, they did that back in even as far back as the pave spinning system and things like that.
Nice.
So I don't know what else stuff you'll have in there, but the guys will have fun playing with that stuff.
All the way to modern, we have the GPU series, all the way up to JDM and JSouth.
Nice.
That's for the Viper and Hornet guys.
Excellent. Yeah, that'll be a lot of fun.
As far as handling characteristics go, like as far as say air-to-air refueling and then low-speed handling for landings and takeoffs, what was that like?
It's not bad. As you slow down with the Phantom, your angle of attack builds, and as your angle of attack builds, your ailerons become less of a primary control surface for roll. Your rudder takes over and becomes your primary high angle of attack roll control surface.
So heavily rudder dependent?
Rudder dependent, and those ailerons need to stay neutral, otherwise you introduce some adverse yaw that causes the airplane to the famous Phantom departure, so it probably gave it its bad name in the beginning.
Probably.
This is a hard wing, so it was even more prone to that. The later models, the E models specifically, was a little friendlier handling airplane, a little more forgiving in that regime.
Okay. So light on the controls, heavy at times, maybe?
And not as heavy on the controls as you probably would guess. Once you get the airspeed up, the controls become pretty light. And at 400 knots, it rolls as lightly as a T-38. It's a very responsive airplane to roll. But as you slow down much below really at 300 knots, a 250 knot regime, level flight, then you're starting to get enough angle of attack that the ailerons just aren't that effective.
Right.
And it's an aileron and a spoiler, so it's not a traditional fighter type of setup.
Kind of like the Tomcat where it deploys the spoilers on one wing to help roll. Now, how about the other side of things as far as acceleration? If you put that thing in full burner, how fast are you going to go and how quickly you're going to get there?
Especially at low altitude, it's a really responsive airplane, so you're going to build airspeed
Rapidly
to the point where you're going to in most air show situations or something where I was limited on speed, I would, my concern would be staying subsonic,
Right.
not building speed, but not getting too much speed.
Okay. What would be a typical do not exceed speed? And I know that's usually configuration and stores dependent, but
Entirely stores dependent. The airplane doesn't really have a traditional VMO like an airliner or something that you do not speed. There are some limitations, but you're never going to reach them.
Okay.
So keep it below 800 knots indicator. You should be okay.
Okay. 800 knots, got it. Now, as far as, let's say, air-to-air refueling, what would be a typical technique that you would use? Because I know in the PC side of things, it tends to get a lot of people frustrated, especially learning that for the first time.
It's no much less frustrating than a real airplane. Most tanker refueling would take place around 310 knots.
Okay, 310.
As I recall. So in that regime, the jet is very pitch sensitive.
Okay.
And unlike the later model fighters that have a recessed air refueling receptacle, the one on the Phantom pops up.
Okay.
So there's nothing to really guide the boom into the air refueling receptacle. So the boomers have a much more challenging time as well.
So you got to get it in the right spot.
And with some loadouts, you'll actually have one engine and afterburner just to have enough thrust, because you're behind the thrust required curve far enough at that speed.
Okay.
If you're heavy, that you'll need a little bit of burner probably to hold it in there.
Oh, wow.
So the best technique is to have a real light touch on the stick as you're attempting to control it in pitch. And if you get to the point where you're just in a pilot-induced oscillation of PIO, it's best to just back away,
And try
let
to
it settle out, and then start over rather than continue to try and force it when you're close to the tanker.
Gotcha. It'd be a bad day for both if something went wrong.
Well, yeah, the tanker's going to call a breakaway very quickly if they start to see you.
Nice.
If they start that happening, that gets their attention in a hurry.
Now, how about a typical mission length? What would be a typical mission length?
So, typical mission duration, it all depends on what you're doing. If you are how many bags of gas you have, how many external tanks. So, a typical air-to-air profile, if you're going to go out and do some basic fighter maneuvers, BFM, dogfighting, you'll probably have a single centerline 600-gallon tank on. So that tank on, you are good for usually about a 1.0. You know, if you're doing a little longer mission, air to ground, usually you'll put the wing tanks on, and that'll give you a little bit more duration, maybe a 1.5, something in that range, maybe 1.8, depending on your altitude. If you're down low and you're doing a target ingress at 550 knots, obviously you're sucking down quite a bit of fuel.
Gotcha.
So.
And I'm glad you just brought up the subject as far as BFM and dogfighting. How is this in a dogfight? What would be an advantage for this? Zoom and boom, or are you going to get in the phone booth with somebody, and slug it out, or
against a modern fighter? Probably your advantage is that you're going to slow down more quickly than they ever anticipated.
Like getting a turn and pull hard and bring that nose around.
The rate that the Phantom bleeds off airspeed under G will probably be eye-opening for a guy in a modern fighter.
Oh, awesome.
No, it wasn't built to be a dogfighting machine, and it's not.
Okay.
It is, in its day, it was superior in thrust, and thrust to weight to a lot of the aircraft. So their tactics against a MiG-17 or 18 were to use the vertical, which as fighter pilots know, you only use the vertical when you have exclusive use of the vertical to go up. So in that day, that was how they fought it. But versus a modern fighter, that doesn't work as well, obviously, because you don't have an exclusive use of the vertical. The modern fighters have better thrust and vertical reach. They'll outclimb you and go up, blow up is kind of the modern thought on that maneuver.
So you're trying to avoid a turn fight and just try to get in and get out as fast as you can?
Yeah, so speed is, it's obviously a fast machine, and especially when you get to lower altitudes, 5,000 to 10,000 feet, its acceleration is really good, you know.
Awesome.
So you have that ability to just, you know, bump and run, and I think that's probably it.
Get in and get out, and try not
Right.
to slug it out with
You
an
don't want to
adversary.
get in a phone booth with any of the modern jets.
Awesome.
Because the difference in turn rate and radius is you know, an F-16 is roughly turns twice as quickly and in half the distance.
It has
So-
a really nice engine to get that thing going fast.
Right, so you don't, but, you know, high speed, the radar that they put in these, I don't know which one you're running in your E-model variant, probably ABQ 120, I would guess.
Possibly.
So the problem with that was it wasn't a pulse Doppler radar, but it still had plenty of power.
Right.
And so it can pick out an enemy at a real decent distance and shoot a you know, a radar guided missile, you know, from beyond visual range, and that's really what that it would excel at.
Awesome. Well, that's pretty much all I got for today. Thank you very much for covering all that and giving us a quick glimpse into
Absolutely.
that, and also for putting on that lovely show we saw earlier with the Collings
Well, it's too
Foundation.
bad we couldn't get it airborne.
That would have made even better film, and I imagine my audience would have really loved that. Anyway, thank you for your service and thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it, folks. I really hope you enjoyed this video. A big thank you to the crew who maintain and operate this aircraft, an iconic piece of American aviation history. I'd also like to thank Lieutenant Colonel Bluto and Crew Chief Al for their service to our country, both having served in the U.S. Air Force. Lastly, I'd also like to thank the Collings Foundation for dedicating the time and resources to preserving not only the Phantom, but other warbirds as well. If you'd like to help the foundation to continue preserving aircraft like this, please consider supporting them. Links will be in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.